The moment I saw the way he looked at me that night, I knew everything was about to change. It wasn't just a glance, it lingered. A slow, assessing look that held something deeper, something unspoken. I should have looked away, should have pretended I didn't notice, but I did. And I couldn't unsee it. It had started as any ordinary evening. My daughter, Anna, had invited me over for dinner, insisting I spend more time with her and her husband, Mark. I adored them both, of course, but the past few months had been chaotic, and I hadn't seen them as often as I used to. Mark, ever the charming and polite man, greeted me with that easy smile of his when I arrived. The house smelled of roasted chicken and warm spices, and Anna moved about the kitchen, setting the table, pouring wine, making small talk. I settled into my usual spot at the dining table, watching as she worked, while Mark stood nearby, glass in hand, listening. I had always found him to be a striking man, confident, strong, with a quiet intensity that made people take notice. He was a provider, dependable, the kind of man a mother would want for her daughter. But that night, something felt different. His gaze flicked to me in a way it never had before. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was the wine warming my veins, making me more aware, more attuned to the energy in the room. Dinner went as expected. Stories exchanged, laughter shared. But every so often, I caught Mark's eyes on me. He wasn't just looking, he was studying. And the more I noticed, the harder it became to ignore. When Anna stepped away to grab dessert, leaving us alone at the table, I took a slow sip of my wine, trying to steady myself. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with something unspoken. "You look beautiful tonight," he said, his voice lower than usual, almost like he wasn't sure if he should say it aloud. I shouldn't have smiled. I shouldn't have felt the way my pulse quickened, but I did. "Thank you," I murmured, meeting his eyes. His expression didn't change, but there was something about the way he held my gaze. Something in the air between us. It was subtle, but undeniable. Anna returned moments later, oblivious to the shift in the room. She placed the dessert plates down, chatting away about something from work, and I forced myself to focus, to act as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. After dinner, as I helped clear the table, Mark moved past me in the kitchen, his arm brushing against mine. It could have been accidental. It should have been. But it wasn't. I turned, and for a brief second, we were closer than we should have been. The air between us charged, thick with something unspoken, yet completely understood. I didn't move, and neither did he. Then, just as quickly, he stepped back, reached for a dish, and the moment was gone. The rest of the night carried on as normal, but I was keenly aware of every glance, every accidental touch. By the time I left, I could feel the weight of something new settling over me. It was dangerous. It was wrong. And yet, I knew this wasn't the end. As I drove home, my fingers gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly, my mind raced with the possibilities, the implications. I had always been careful, always controlled, but something had shifted that night. I knew I should forget it, let it fade, pretend it never happened. But the truth was, I didn't want to, and that was the most dangerous part of all. The days that followed were a blur of routine, but underneath the surface, I was anything but composed. My mind wandered at the worst moments, drifting in meetings, losing track of conversations, distracted by the memory of Mark's eyes on me. I knew better than to indulge these thoughts. I reminded myself of boundaries, of the unspoken rules of decorum, of family. And yet, when Anna called to invite me over for dinner again the following Friday, I hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. This time, I took more care in my appearance. A soft blue dress that hugged in just the right places, a touch of perfume at the wrists and neck, a deliberate but subtle choice of earrings. It was innocent enough, or so I told myself. When I arrived, Mark opened the door. Anna was in the kitchen. She called out a hello, but he stood there, his eyes sweeping over me in a way that sent a ripple down my spine. "You look lovely," he said, his voice quieter than before. as if it were just for me to hear. I let out a small laugh, brushing past him. It's just a dress. But we both knew it wasn't just a dress. It was a choice, a message I wasn't sure I was ready to admit to sending. Dinner unfolded much like the last time. The three of us engaged in easy conversation. Yet I felt the awareness simmering just beneath the surface. Every glance from Mark felt heavier. Every moment we were near each other seemed to stretch. Anna, blissfully unaware, talked about a weekend trip she wanted to plan for them. But I barely heard her. I was too focused on Mark's hand resting against the table, the subtle shift of his fingers as he tapped them against the wood. It was nothing, and yet it wasn't. After dinner, we moved to the living room with glasses of wine. Anna had curled up against Mark's side, laughing as she scrolled through something on her phone. I sat across from them, watching the domesticity of it, feeling something complicated twist in my chest. It should have been a reality check. Instead, it felt like an invitation to something I couldn't name. At one point, Anna excused herself to take a call. Mark and I sat there in the quiet space, the only sound, the faint hum of the television in the background. "You've been quiet tonight," he said, shifting slightly to face me. I met his gaze, my pulse quickening. "Just tired." He studied me for a moment, then leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "No, it's something else." There was a challenge in his voice, a quiet, knowing provocation that sent a thrill through me. I swallowed, forcing myself to hold his gaze. "And what do you think it is?" His lips twitched, as if he were considering his answer carefully. But before he could say anything, Anna re-entered the room, breaking whatever spell had momentarily tethered us together. As the night wound down, I told myself I had imagined it all, that nothing was happening, that nothing could happen. But when I stood to leave, Mark walked me to the door. Anna had wandered off to check something in the kitchen, leaving us in the dimly lit entryway. His hand brushed against mine, a fleeting, deliberate touch that lingered just long enough to steal my breath. "Good night," he said, voice low. I barely managed to whisper the same before stepping outside, my heart pounding. I drove home in silence, the air in my car thick with unspoken thoughts, unacknowledged possibilities. I knew I should stay away. I knew I should end this before it ever truly began. But deep down, I also knew I wouldn't. Over the next few days, my thoughts strayed more often than they should. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that look in Mark's eyes, that lingering touch that neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. It was dangerous, intoxicating, and I was teetering on the edge of something I didn't yet understand. Then, another invitation came. "A casual Sunday brunch," Anna said. "Nothing fancy, just the three of us again." I should have declined, but my fingers typed out a quick, "Of course," before I could even think. When I arrived, the air between Mark and me was thick with unspoken awareness. Anna bustled about the kitchen, chatting happily, while I tried to focus on anything but the way Mark's eyes followed me. The table was set, the food smelled delicious, but my appetite was for something else entirely. As we ate, Mark's foot brushed against mine beneath the table. It was light, barely there, but it sent a jolt straight through me. I tried to tell myself it was an accident, but when it happened again, I knew it wasn't. I should have moved, should have shifted away, but I didn't. Instead, I let it linger, my breath coming just a little quicker. After we finished eating, Anna excused herself to take a call outside. I knew it was coming before it happened, knew that Mark would take that chance, and he did. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt my pulse hammer in my throat. "Mark?" He shook his head, stepping closer. "Don't tell me you don't feel it too." I should have denied it. I should have walked away, but I didn't. Instead, I stood there, my heart racing, every nerve in my body attuned to his proximity. Anna's voice floated in from outside, snapping me back to reality. I stepped back, creating space, my breathing unsteady. "We can't do this," I whispered. But the words felt empty even as I said them. Mark nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. I know. And yet, we both knew it was a lie. The days that followed were restless. My mind replayed Mark's words, the way he had stepped closer, the quiet intensity of his voice. I told myself I had imagined it, that it was nothing more than a moment of reckless impulse. But I knew better. The truth was, I felt it too. I tried to bury it beneath distractions. I threw myself into work, made plans with friends, anything to keep myself occupied. But it wasn't enough. Every night, as I lay in bed, I felt the ghost of his presence, his eyes on me, his voice low and careful, like a secret he wasn't supposed to share. Then, one evening, I got a message. A simple, innocuous text from Anna, inviting me over for dinner again. It was routine by now, another evening spent together as family. But as I stared at the message, I couldn't ignore the hesitation in my fingers before I typed my reply. I knew what awaited me. I knew the weight of the choice I was about to make. And still, I said yes. This time, I didn't dress with caution. I didn't try to hide the way I wanted to be seen. A fitted blouse, a skirt that sat just right on my hips, heels just high enough to make me stand a little taller. I told myself it was just dinner, but my heart betrayed me, beating faster than it should have as I pulled into their driveway. Mark opened the door again. Anna's voice came from the kitchen, but for a moment, it was just the two of us, standing there in the quiet. "Hi," he said, his voice steady, but there was something beneath it, something only I could hear. "Hi," I replied, and for a second, neither of us moved. Then, as if remembering himself, he stepped back, gesturing for me to come inside. I did, my pulse unsteady, the air between us thick with everything left unsaid. Anna greeted me with a hug, oblivious to the tension in the room. She handed me a glass of wine, pulling me into conversation about something from work. But my mind was elsewhere. I felt Mark's presence behind me, the heat of it, the way he was close enough to touch but didn't. Dinner was a careful dance of stolen glances, of hands brushing when plates were passed, of the air thickening with every moment we spent in the same space. And Anna, so sweet, so trusting, had no idea. After the meal, she stood to clean up, waving me off when I offered to help. "Sit, relax," she said. "You're our guest." Mark didn't move either, and soon, it was just the two of us in the dim glow of the dining room. I shouldn't have looked at him. I should have turned away, started talking about something safe. But I didn't. "I don't know what to do with this," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Mark exhaled, shaking his head. "Neither do I." And yet, neither of us moved away. His hand was on the table, fingers curled loosely, and before I knew what I was doing, I reached out, just barely, just enough for my fingertips to brush against his. It was reckless. It was dangerous. But it was real. He didn't pull away. His fingers shifted, brushing against mine, his breath catching just slightly. It was the smallest touch, but it felt like a confession. Then, footsteps. Anna's voice, light and cheerful, approaching from the kitchen. We pulled apart in an instant, and by the time she walked back in, we were nothing more than two people sitting across from each other at the table. Nothing had happened, and yet everything had. That night, as I drove home, my hands were unsteady on the wheel. I had spent weeks telling myself I could stop this, that it was all in my head. But it wasn't, and the worst part was, I didn't want it to be. I should have ended it. I should have stopped answering invitations, made excuses, put distance between us. But I didn't, and I knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before we crossed a line we couldn't come back from. Days passed, and I found myself waiting for another invitation, another excuse to be near him. It came sooner than I expected. Anna invited me to help her plan an upcoming party for their friends. She insisted I come over one afternoon to go over menu ideas and decorations. I agreed without hesitation, and the moment I stepped into their house, I knew it was a mistake. Anna was in the backyard, taking a call, leaving me alone with Mark. He stood by the kitchen counter, watching me, his fingers tapping lightly against the marble surface. "I thought about you," he said, breaking the silence. My breath hitched. "Mark?" He shook his head, taking a slow step forward. "Tell me you haven't thought about me too. I should have denied it. I should have walked out the door. Instead, I stayed rooted in place, my heart pounding. "I don't know what you want me to say," I whispered. He stopped a foot away from me, his gaze searching mine. "Say you don't feel it." I opened my mouth, but no words came, because I couldn't say it. I couldn't lie. A sharp noise from outside made me jolt. Anna's laughter, drifting through the open patio doors. Reality crashed back in. I took a step back, shaking my head. "We can't do this," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Mark exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know." But we both knew the truth. The line we had been dancing around was growing thinner by the day. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing this wasn't over, not even close. I tried to avoid Anna's calls for a few days, telling myself that distance would help. It didn't. The space between visits only made my mind wander further, filling the silence with thoughts I shouldn't be having. But it wasn't just my mind. It was my body, too. The way my fingers itched to reach for my phone, the way my pulse quickened whenever I imagined seeing him again. When Anna called me again, asking if I wanted to go shopping with her for the party, I almost refused. But she was persistent, and in the end, I found myself saying yes. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was something else entirely. The day of our shopping trip, I met Anna at a busy outdoor mall. She greeted me with a warm hug, oblivious to the turmoil I was carrying. She chatted excitedly about decorations, food choices, and guest lists. Her happiness so genuine, it made my stomach twist. I nodded along, pretending to listen, but my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking of him, wondering if he was at home, if he had asked about me, if he was thinking of me in the same way I was thinking of him. We spent hours shopping, weaving in and out of stores, loading the trunk of her car with bags. At some point, she sighed dramatically and pulled me toward a small cafe. "Let's take a break. I need caffeine, and you need to tell me what's been going on with you." I forced a laugh. "What do you mean?" She tilted her head, studying me in that way only a close friend, or in this case, a daughter, could. "You've been different lately. Distant, distracted. Something's going on." I swallowed, searching for the right words. Something safe and convincing. "Work has been stressful. You know how it is." She didn't look convinced, but she let it go, shifting the conversation back to the party. I let out a quiet breath of relief. If only she knew the real reason behind my distraction. By the time I got home that evening, I was emotionally exhausted. I had spent hours playing the part of a doting mother, pushing away thoughts I didn't want to entertain, but they crept back in the moment I stepped into the quiet of my house. And then, my phone vibrated. A single message from an unknown number. "I can't stop thinking about you." My breath hitched. I knew exactly who it was. I should have deleted the message. I should have blocked the number. Instead, I stared at it, my heart hammering in my chest. I typed out a reply, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. Minutes passed, and then another message came. "Say something, anything." I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. Then, before I could stop myself, I responded, "This is wrong. His reply was immediate. I know, but it doesn't change anything. I wanted to argue, to remind him of all the reasons we couldn't do this. But the truth was, he was right. It didn't change anything. The pull between us was still there, growing stronger every time we were near each other. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, felt the weight of his gaze. The next morning, I deleted the messages, but it was too late. The damage was already done. A few days later, Anna called again, inviting me over for an early dinner. I hesitated before agreeing, telling myself it would be fine, that I could control myself, that nothing would happen. But the moment I walked into their house, I knew I had been lying to myself. Anna was in the kitchen, fussing over something on the stove. Mark was in the living room, sitting on the couch, his eyes immediately locking onto mine as I stepped inside. The room suddenly felt too warm, the air too thick. I forced a smile, pretending not to notice the way his gaze lingered. Where do you need me? Just sit. Relax, Anna called from the kitchen. I won't be long. Mark didn't move, but his eyes never left me. Slowly, I walked over to the couch, keeping a careful distance as I sat. You didn't respond after that last message, he said quietly. I exhaled sharply. Because I knew I shouldn't. His jaw tightened. But you wanted to. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. He already knew. We sat in silence, the tension between us almost unbearable. Then, Anna called from the kitchen, asking for help with something. I practically leaped from the couch, grateful for the distraction. But the moment our hands brushed, as I reached for a plate, I knew we were past the point of pretending this wasn't real. This was happening, and there was no turning back. The moment our hands brushed, a current passed between us, subtle but impossible to ignore. I snatched mine away quickly, but the damage was already done. The way Mark looked at me, the way my breath caught in my throat, it was too much, too dangerous. I turned to help Anna with the dishes, my hands trembling as I gripped a plate. I could feel Mark's presence behind me, the heat of him just close enough to make my skin prickle. Anna hummed as she moved around the kitchen, oblivious to the storm brewing between us. She chatted about the upcoming party, about how much work she still had to do, about how grateful she was that Mark had been helping out so much. I nodded, responding in the right places, but my mind was elsewhere. When I finally excused myself for the night, Mark walked me to the door. Anna stayed in the kitchen, still absorbed in her work. The moment the door clicked shut behind us, the silence between us was thick, humming with the words we couldn't say. I shouldn't be doing this, I whispered. I know, he said, but I don't want to stop. Neither did I. I should have stepped away. I should have walked to my car, driven home, locked the door behind me, and let this be nothing more than an unspoken mistake. But I didn't move. Neither did he. Mark's hand lifted, hovering near my arm before he finally let his fingers graze my skin. It was such a light touch, barely there, but it sent a jolt through me. I think about you all the time, he murmured. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding. This isn't right. But it's real. I should have argued, but I didn't, because he was right. This wasn't just some fleeting infatuation, some silly game. It was something deeper, something dangerous, something we had no control over anymore. The moment hung between us, fragile, intense, waiting for one of us to break it. And then he did. His fingers slid up my arm, his touch warm and firm, and I didn't pull away. His other hand came up, cupping my face, his thumb grazing over my cheek. I need to go, I whispered, but I made no move to step back. His lips parted like he wanted to say something, but instead, he leaned in. I felt the warmth of his breath, the moment before his lips touched mine, the hesitation, the choice. And then finally, we crossed the line. The kiss was slow, deliberate, as if we were memorizing each other. My hands gripped his shirt, pulling him closer, even as my mind screamed at me to stop. But I couldn't. He pressed me back against the doorframe, his body firm against mine. His hands traced my arms, my waist, my back, and every touch left fire in its wake. We shouldn't have been doing this. We knew that. But knowing didn't stop us. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew the door to the house was still open, that Anna was only a few feet away, unaware of what was happening just outside her home. The thought should have stopped me, but it didn't. When we finally pulled away, we were both breathless. His forehead rested against mine, our breaths mingling in the cool night air. "This can't happen again," I said, but my voice was weak. Mark exhaled heavily. "I don't believe you." I didn't believe me either. I left without another word, climbing into my car and gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I stared straight ahead, my heart racing, my lips still tingling from his touch. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. And worst of all, I didn't regret it. The days that followed were unbearable. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a rush of anticipation, only to be met with disappointment when it wasn't him. I kept telling myself I should block his number, ignore his calls, pretend nothing had ever happened. But I didn't, because I was waiting. And then finally, he called. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. "Mark, I need to see you." I squeezed my eyes shut. "No, you don't." "Yes, I do." Silence stretched between us, heavy and thick. "Come over," I whispered. The moment the words left my lips, I knew I couldn't take them back, and I didn't want to. Mark arrived less than an hour later. The second I opened the door, he was on me. His hands tangled in my hair, his lips claiming mine, like he had been starving for this moment. And maybe he had. Maybe we both had. I didn't think about the consequences. I didn't think about Anna. All I could think about was the way he felt against me, the way his hands roamed my body like he had every right to be there. That night, we lost ourselves completely. We gave in to every stolen glance, every accidental touch, every unspoken desire that had been simmering beneath the surface for months. And in the morning, when the sun poured through my bedroom window and reality came crashing back in, I realized something chilling. I wasn't just someone caught in an affair. I was in love with him. The realization hit me like a freight train. I sat up, wrapping the sheets around me, watching as Mark stirred beside me. He looked peaceful, unaware of the chaos unraveling inside me. I should have felt guilty. I should have felt shame. But I didn't, because despite everything, despite the risk, despite the betrayal, I wanted him, and I had no idea how to stop. We tried to be careful after that, but it was impossible. Every time we were together, it only got harder to stay away. The stolen moments turned into hours. The secrets turned into whispered confessions. And the guilt, it faded, replaced by something stronger, something neither of us wanted to name. But affairs don't stay hidden forever. It happened on an ordinary evening, when I least expected it. My phone was on the counter, buzzing with a message. I thought nothing of it as I picked it up. But when I glanced up, Anna was standing there, her eyes locked onto the screen, her face drained of color. "What is this?" she whispered. Panic gripped me. "Anna!" But she already knew. I could see it in her eyes. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the disbelief. Mark walked into the room then, freezing when he saw us. His eyes flickered between me and Anna, realization dawning on his face. "Tell me this isn't happening." Anna's voice shook, but I couldn't, because it was happening, and there was no undoing it. The silence stretched, unbearable. And then, finally, Anna turned and walked away. Just like that, everything came crashing down. Mark reached for me, but I shook my head. "Go after her." His jaw clenched. "I don't want to." But he did. We both knew he did. And so, I let him go. I watched as he disappeared after her, knowing that whatever we had ruined, it was over. And yet, as I stood there, alone and heartbroken, I still wasn't sure if I regretted it. Because for one fleeting moment, I had everything I ever wanted, and I had never felt more alive.